We're going to go over Chapter 8, the Early Republic. This is from 1790 to 1820. And in this chapter, we're going to cover three main topics: the dilemmas of national identity, extending federal power, and remaking America's economic character. So this is all the things that we have to deal with after we finally have gained, our independence is recognized after 1783, kind of some growing pains that we have to go through as an early republic. So the first is education for a new nation. Like, how can we really unite all of our citizens? And one way to do that is by really having a standard form of education that we present. And so education was tied to the needs of the new nation. Noah Webster, you probably heard of Webster's Dictionary before, he came out with an American spelling book, an American dictionary of the English language, and they were used nationally and helped standardize American English. So if you think about it, like, a lot of different regions would have different spellings for the same word. Today we don't have that, right? It's all very standardized. But imagine the word color. So if you were living in a heavily influenced British area of America, you would spell color C-O-L-O-U-R. Other places would spell it C-O-L-O-R, right? Drop that U. So we start to see Noah Webster dropping a lot of these added vowels and shortening words and making it really an American style of language and also American pronunciation. We do see the number of schools increasing greatly after the Revolution, and plans for free public education are going to spread. Existing colleges like Harvard and William & Mary, those were viewed with suspicion because of their English roots. You have to remember, those were established when we were still English colonies. And those roots, there was that potential for students to be corrupted in urban areas where vice was more plentiful, resulting in really this push for the creation of new colleges based on these revolutionary ideas. So we're going to start to see frontier schools opening up. And frontier schools and colleges, and they're going to be established to educate the nation's youth. And these schools emphasize their isolation away from the cities, away from their parents, as a way to assure parents that education was the main focus, unlike those schools in those big cities. The wives and families of faculty and administrators, they do play an important role as well at these schools, and they really help to create a communal and familial atmosphere for students. Here's a book that was published in 1815. This is Marmaduke Multiply's Merry Method of Making Minor Mathematics. You notice that all those M's. So 4 times 6 are 24. I think I've seen your face before. 4 times 7 are 28. Come with me and see me skate. See the rhyming, the articulation going on there. So really just an example of an early mathematics book for you. So we also are going to see some literary and cultural development. So we talked about how we're going to educate the youth. Now, what about some kind of higher ed? What are we going to do there? So cultural groups such as the Hartford Wits from Yale contributed to the growing national culture by creating works that express distinctly American perspectives. Advances in technology increased the circulation of novels, which in turn helped shape women's roles and expectations regarding marriage as women began reading more of those novels. In the early 19th century, we see the emergence of significant American literary figures like Washington Irving, whose short stories and essays took both lighthearted and more sober aim at traditional views and romanticized visions of American history. We also see books celebrating the nation's past and its culture. They were very popular in the early 19th century. And the nation's history and its emphasis on liberty were reflected in artistic works as well. Nature engravings also became popular, and they blended art and education. We see groups such as Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society, that was co-founded by Benjamin Franklin. They promoted American literature and science. American artists and scientists benefited from European knowledge, but they also really took a lot of pride in American ingenuity. We are also going to see some religious renewal, and by 1820, the Methodist Church was the largest denomination in the nation, followed closely by Baptists. Believing that everyone could gain salvation, the two denominations appealed to small farmers, workers, and the poor, as well as women, to African Americans, who, remember, we do have the first African American church that is established in New York, and the first really African American denomination is that sect of the Methodist denomination. In rural area, And on the frontier, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians organized camp meetings where a dozen or more preachers, a lot of them didn't have formal training, but they did tap into these deep wells of spirituality. We are going to see some racial limits, though, of American culture. And to help forge a national identity, white Americans employed a variety of American Indian-inspired themes, names, and symbols. Poets and writers, especially in New England, emphasized the noble nature of Indians in their works, promoting this romanticized view of a lost culture. American Indians were viewed less favorably in frontier regions where they continued to fight for their lands and rights. Artists and authors frequently portrayed both Indians and African Americans in very demeaning ways. The lack of access that Indians and African Americans had to formal education or established publishers meant that written portrayals of minority groups, whether they were romanticized or demonized, were typically completed by white Americans and reflected their views and also white bias on these groups rather than the experiences of minorities. White Americans' concern for improved education did not extend to Indians or African Americans, and free blacks were then forced to establish their own schools, and they formed their own literary societies. But white Americans, for the most part, are going to deny any type of education. White leaders believed education should play a different but still limited role for American Indians, and we do see a small number of Indians were educated by missionaries or in Eastern schools, but their education focused not on Indian languages or histories, but on non-Indian subjects and white English history. The differing educational goals and strategies white Americans adopted for Indians and African Americans reflect different views of each group. So, for instance, Indians were seen as uncivilized, but as having potential, whereas African Americans were viewed as inherently inferior and thus unworthy of any effort to educate them. Some African Americans and a lot of white Americans questioned blacks' future in the nation, even outside of slavery, resulting in proposals for settlement in Africa. Ideas of settlement in Africa, like this immigration as blacks saw it, like leaving America, and colonization as whites saw it, became a focus of the American Colonization Society and others seeking to end slavery or to solve race problems. Many northern free blacks opposed immigration, leaving, however, because they viewed it as prejudice in nature. The expansion of and the dependency on slavery in the South made settlement in Africa an impractical solution. And we're going to talk more about that, obviously, as we move through and get closer and closer to the Civil War. But we're going to switch over and talk about a new capital for a new nation. The construction of the nation's new capital highlighted the role of slave labor, as its location was surrounded by slave owners. Slaves helped clear the land, slaves helped build the roads, and slaves constructed buildings, and a limited number provided skilled or domestic labor. Free blacks, such as Benjamin Banneker, also participated in building the Capitol. So we have this like weird mix of a lot of enslaved people and then also a few free blacks who were being paid for their services. A diverse group of workers, including American and immigrant laborers and foreign architects and engineers, helped build Washington City, underlying the American nature of the capital. The geography and climate of the city contributed to some negative impressions of this Republican capital. The capital was at the center of the nation's political world, but the social aspects of the city helped define it as well, as politicians and their wives helped create an identity for Washington City. The disparate worlds of the capital, such as that of the powerful and that of the slaves and other laborers, highlighted the discrepancies in American life and through thought in early years of the Republic. Here's a picture of the Capitol when it's first being built. And you can kind of see it's kind of out in the middle of the country, right? Not a whole lot around it. But what you have to remember is this is supposed to be like this shining beacon to the rest of the world. Like this is what democracy can give you, right? We fought for our independence, we won, but it's also surrounded by slaves and surrounded by slavery all around Washington, all around our capital. So we're going to talk about extending federal power, and we're going to look at Jefferson. So after Jefferson took office in 1801, the Democratic Republicans quickly put into operation their visions for the nation, which included limiting the power of a federal government, shrinking the national debt by reducing government expenditures, ending federal legislation, and limiting the power of the Bank of the United States. Foreign events forced President Jefferson to draw on his presidential powers. His refusal to pay tribute to the Barbary pirates of North Africa resulted in attacks on American ships, and Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps to retaliate, and ultimately, we don't beat the pirates, we just negotiate a lower tribute payment than before. In 1803, the Haitian Revolution succeeded in establishing the first independent black-led nation in the Americas. So this is in the Caribbean, right? We have Haiti on one side of the island, the Dominican Republic on the other, and Haiti is going to lead a rebellion. They're going to overthrow French rule, and they are going to establish themselves as this independent nation that is led by blacks. It was a huge deal, and it's very scary because the Caribbean, Haiti is not too far from the Americas, and it does scare a lot of rich, wealthy Americans in the South, especially. Like, if this could happen in Haiti, they could lead this rebellion and they could overthrow white rule, then it can happen here in the States too. And so we also see a lot of Haitian refugees fleeing to the United States after 1791. And the Haitian Revolution, like I said, it alarmed a lot of Southern whites who feared it would inspire a slave rebellion in the United States. And such a plan, it is uncovered in Virginia, and that just even more highlights slave owners' fears about what could happen. So following that French defeat in Haiti, Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to secure navigation rights on the Mississippi River. And instead, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana purchase to the United States for $15 million. And while the land purchase fell outside a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which that's Jefferson, literal interpretation, not the loose interpretation like Hamilton, so he's going to kind of go back on what he believes about the strict interpretation of the Constitution. He's going to ultimately agree to it. And that pleases a lot of politicians and ordinary Americans, most of whom didn't care that it expanded presidential and congressional powers at the time. Congress is going to send an expedition called the Corps of Discovery to map the new territory, and Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the expedition. The Corps was assisted in efforts by numerous Indians, including Sacagawea, who traveled with the expedition. Also among the members of the expedition was an African-American slave named York. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike explored the southern portion of the Louisiana Territory starting in 1806. Mexican forces captured and later released his men, but not before Pike had explored much of the area that would become part of the United States in later decades. Jefferson won re-election in 1804, but his goal of reining in federal powers had not been achieved by that point just yet. So just to give you an idea of this territory that we're talking about, hopefully you've all heard of this before growing up, talking about the Louisiana Purchase. So really all we were trying to negotiate was just navigation at the port of New Orleans and navigating up and down the Mississippi River. Instead, we were offered all of this in orange for $15 million. That was a really good deal. And Napoleon was trying to sell that off to the United States to recover from the war debt, to recover from the Haitian Revolution, to send more forces. So that's why we get this at such a great rate. And here you can see in red, this is Pike's exploration going into what was then Mexico territory. And then also this is Lewis and Clark. And you'll notice the two do separate. Lewis returns to the north and Clark returns kind of here to the south, but exploring this area along the way, and then also bringing stuff back into Washington, D.C. and bringing reports back to Thomas Jefferson. Let's talk about the federal court for a few minutes. And so before the Federalists were voted out of power, the Federalist Party, they were voted out of power in 1800. They had established their dominance in the judicial branch by passing the Judiciary Act. And what that act does is it creates new courts and judgeships, which were filled by those Federalists, right? Not the Democratic Republicans. And appointing the Supreme Court's new Chief Justice, the Federalists did that also, and filled that by John Marshall. And John Marshall's going to kind of set a whole lot of precedents in the early republic. For instance, his ruling in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. that helps to establish the principle of judicial review. The Supreme Court had the power and the authority to decide on the constitutionality of federal laws. So that's why we see a lot of, anytime we have the Constitution brought up in some of these court cases, the federal Supreme Court gets to look over that, and they get to make those decisions because of this precedent set in 1803. The following year, the court ruled that it had the power of judicial review over state laws as well. The Supreme Court upheld Federalist principles in other cases, such as McCulloch versus Maryland. This is in 1819, which reinforced the Federalist ideas of this loose interpretation, like Hamilton wanted, of the Constitution through the implied powers clause, necessary and proper. Marshall's leadership of the Supreme Court established the judicial branch as equal in importance to Congress as the president in terms of framing and preserving a national agenda. So you have the executive branch, which is ran by the president. You have the judicial branch, which is ran by the Supreme Court. And we have our legislative branch, which is ran by Congress. Well, we have the Federalists that are kind of pushed out. They're still in these really high-powered positions like the Supreme Court, but they're not running the country because Jefferson is not a Federalist. He's a Democratic Republican. So what he's going to do is try to expand federal powers. The conflict between France and England is going to continue to threaten U.S. security even during Jefferson's administration. And in an effort to end U.S. trade with France, British naval ships stopped the U.S. and forced it into service more than 8,000 sailors. Here we are again with impressment, right? We've seen that even before the Revolution. We're going to see them still taking U.S. ships and impressing more than 8,000 sailors into the British Navy. These are supposedly U.S. citizens that they're doing this to. About 3,000 are confirmed U.S. citizens. Congress passed the Embargo Act in 1807, and that was in an effort to economically pressure Great Britain to end its restrictions on trade and also impressment. While the act kept the nation out of war, it does have a negative impact on U.S. commerce. So merchants, farmers, and planters, they're going to protest that embargo, and it resulted in an economic recession and expanded federal power regarding trade. Jefferson's action as president, especially his advocacy of the Embargo Act, that increased the power of the federal government overall, and many small farmers were angered that a man who had formerly championed their rights would enact measures that had such a devastating impact on them. Even with these critiques, though, most Americans remained pleased with Jefferson's administration. Here's a political cartoon, though, kind of talking negatively about the Embargo Act. You'll notice here at the bottom, it's embargo spelled backwards, or the American snapping turtle. So here we have a snapping turtle, right? And on the, here it says, like, darn it, how he nicks them. Oh, this cursed, and it's embargo again spelled backwards. But it's just showing, like, businesses, like this is the American, government trying to stop merchants and farmers from making any money because they no longer can trade with anyone. Although everyone seems very pleased with Jefferson, minus the Embargo Act, we're going to see, remaking of America's economic character. We're going to come out of that embargo eventually. But let's first focus on the U.S. population, how it grows and how it starts to migrate out to the West. So we see population increases in the United States spur the growth of federal powers and heightened conflicts with Indians over slavery. But they also, expanding out, we are getting into Indian territory. But I guess a positive, if you could find a positive, is that it also fueled improvements in communication, manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation, while Western migration pushed Indian tribes off their lands and further west. This white Western migration is pushing them off. The populations of towns and cities, we do see an increase, both in the east and further west. And the government's also going to offer favorable terms for buying Western lands, and this convinced a lot of yeoman farmers and others to start moving out to the West, even if doing so brought them into conflict with groups already living there. Growing populations in the West increased the need for transportation systems such as roads and turnpikes to ship goods and crops. So you can see here these Indian cessions, like Indians being forced to give up their land. So this all happened before 1784, right? Here's the colonies, kind of the original 13 colonies area, a little bit down into Georgia here. Between 1784 and 1820, it's this lighter green shade. And then after 1820 is the dark green. And this we'll talk about when we talk about the Trail of Tears, these secessions. And these aren't, we like to think sometimes that these are, oh, well, they were given treaties and, more land, better opportunity. Really, this is forced. They are forcefully removed from their land, and they don't really get anything great in return for it. Interstate trade demand federal funding of international improvements to transportation, such as the National Road. So that's kind of cool that we have this national road being built. We also see a need for improved efficiency in water transportation, and that's going to result in the construction of canals to connect river systems and the building of steamboats for sending goods upriver, because before you could only go downriver, right? We need some type of mechanism or some type of engine that can get those boats back upriver against the current. So in 1804, Oliver Evans invented a high-pressure steam engine, and he attached it to a dredge to clean around docks. But he lacked the funds to apply this invention to a steam-powered boat. So Robert Fulton, he was funded by Ambassador Robert Livingston, and what he does is he improves on Evans' invention, and in 1807 he launched the first steamboat, kicking off the steamboat era in the West. And I'm going to skip over that for just a second because I want to show you this is Robert Fulton's, this is the Clermont, this is 1813, about 6 years after we have like the first steamboats, right, by Fulton. So there it is, just this long, pretty simple boat, right? Let me go back here. Okay, so the multiplier effect. That is in which one invention prompted others. And the most visible is the cotton gin and the spinning wheel. Those are inventions that transformed Southern agriculture and Northern industry. So in the South, you're going to see the cotton gin. That raw cotton is taken to the North, and we're going to see the spinning wheel used to turn that raw cotton into thread. Right? So Samuel Slater, an English mill supervisor, he brought with him to the United States his plans for a replica of a yarn spinning machine. And with funding from Rhode Island inventors, Slater built a spinning mill. Slater's mill, it opened in 1790, and it spawned other factories and mills in New England, providing work for women and children and increasing the demand for that southern cotton. And the demand for cotton spurred another invention to help make cotton profitable in regions where only short staple cotton, which required irons of intensive labor to separate seeds from cotton fiber, could be grown. So those of you that are from here, go out during cotton season, right? Get some cotton off the side of the road. Go through it and try to pick out all those seeds. It's super sticky and it takes forever to clean cotton. So the cotton gin, it would take that cotton, take all those sticky seeds out, and you could clean cotton way faster than you could by hand using the cotton gin. With that invention of the cotton gin, we're going to see cotton spread incredibly quickly throughout the South, and the demand for labor to plant and pick cotton is also going to exponentially grow. In 1793, Eli Whitney built the cotton gin to solve that problem with the short staple cotton and cleaning it, and his machine could accomplish in 1 hour what several workers would take an entire day to achieve, pulling those seeds out. In the midst of a quasi-war with France, the government contracted with Whitney to produce 4,000 rifles. To meet this demand, Whitney proposed that machines could produce the various parts of a rifle, which could then be assembled quickly. Whitney's mass production model became known as the American System of Manufacturing. So he doesn't get a whole lot of money off the cotton gin, but he does get a whole lot of money with the government contract of mass producing rifles and creating the American System of Manufacturing. And that allowed less skilled workers to produce goods without needing a lengthy apprenticeship. Think about car factories, right? That's the assembly line. That's pretty much what he's inventing. The inventions of people like Slater and Whitney laid the groundwork for future inventions and altered the lives of generations of factory workers and slaves whose labor contributed to the final products. Whitney and Slater were only two among a multitude of inventors whose creations were viewed as a hallmark of the ingenuity of the young United States between 1790 and 1820. Improvements on existing inventions led to other inventions, and another example is Francis Cabot's power loom for weaving. It's like our first binary code with these holes punched out that would tell the loom where to weave, what colors to weave. So kind of cool, the ones and zeros. Use it for a power loom in the beginning. The evolutionary nature of these inventions allowed for gradual improvement, and this comforted many Americans who saw either small mills or household enterprises as really the ideal of American economy. The Embargo Act created a greater need for domestic production because, remember, we can't really sell or buy goods from anyone outside. It's eventually going to go we can't do any goods or trading with Britain and France and then just Britain. But that's going to create a lot of domestic production and the need for domestic production. And both factories and household producers met this need. Husbands and wives working together to create a final product took different roles in these domestic enterprises. The patterns of that companionate marriage were emerged, and especially among younger couples, were aided by older versions of mutuality in which domestic production also relied on the work of children, on the work of your neighbors and servants. Servants and slaves alike saw the roles within the domestic labor grow. Mistresses in both northern households and southern plantations, they began to expand their roles as domestic managers. And at the turn of the century, the majority of Americans still lived on small farms and traded locally to obtain any goods that they could not produce themselves. But by 1820, new inventions and the expansion of the market economy had transformed their lives. The cotton gin impacted all regions of the United States and tied them closer together. The demand for cotton in northern mills meant an expanding cotton agriculture in the South, while western farmers felt increased pressure to produce food for the nation. While the cotton gin reduced one aspect of slave labor, it ultimately quashed any ideas of abolition. Growth in the demand for cotton led to an increased need for slavery in the South, as plantation owners expanded their land holdings to plant more cotton. And as a result of this increased demand for cotton, slave populations grew. Through domestic trade, illegal smuggling from Africa and the Caribbean, because we've outlawed the international slave trade by 1806, but we still are going to have a lot of slaves coming in over on the black market. Not only that smuggling, but also natural increase. The number of slaves in the United States more than doubled between 1790 and 1820, from 700,000 to 1.5 million, and the price of slaves also doubled between 1895 and 1805. Cotton's expansion throughout the South and into the West required additional lands and expanded slavery into new regions, including Indian lands, as Creek and Cherokee Indians adapted to cotton cultivation and even purchased slaves themselves. Here is a depiction of the cotton gin. This is from 1793, but you can see here people are bringing in cotton. They're putting it, here, but they're also, this is the cotton gin. It had think of two combs, right? Pulling the cotton and pulling the seeds out of the cotton. Slaves were an important element of the South's geographical expansion, but moving west frequently broke up slave families. Slaves who were forced to move to new plantations employed various methods to slow down production and limit their owner's control, ranging from running away to purposely breaking tools. Planters increased dependency on slaves. That, coupled with the elimination of the international slave trade, provided slaves with a limited amount of leverage, ensuring, for example, better food to prolong slaves' productivity. The increase in slave population also led to more extensive slave kinship networks. The religious revivals that marked American society at this time were also seen in slave and white frontier communities. Camp meetings provided opportunities for different groups to find limited release from their day-to-day burdens. Religious revivalism and revolutionary ideas regarding freedom inspired different slave rebellions, as in Virginia in 1800 when Gabriel, a slave, plotted to kill all white supporters of slavery. Although informants betrayed Gabriel to white authorities before he could execute his plan, news of the plot reminded white Southerners of the potential dangers of slavery. And we're going to end there with Chapter 8, and we're going to continue our discussion of all of these things, obviously. But in chapter 9, we're going to start talking about defending and redefining the nation. And we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy, and also the War of 1812.